So, guys, if you're joining me, and you have for the last couple of weeks, you'll be well aware of the concept by now. But just for those that haven't managed to tune in so far, my name is Leanna Devine. I'm an integrative therapist from Brixton, South London, and I created a podcast to enlighten people on the A to Z of issues that could be affecting them with their mental health. The aim is to become your own therapist. So you may have listened to the episodes on attachment and anxiety, and now we've moved on to B. We have an issue on boundaries, which will be included separately, but today the topic on the podcast is being Black and British. Now, I must have to admit, when I first came up with the idea of this, I put it out to all my friends, what they would like to see on the podcast. And this particular friend who's in front of me now, who I'm just about to introduce to the podcast, really fought hard for this to be something that got discussed. So it only makes sense that she's the one to come on this podcast and share her experiences of both being Black and British and also of being a therapist, also from Brixton, South London, out here in the world dealing with clients and particularly with an area of interest in young people. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ez to the podcast. So Ez, these people will not have maybe ever heard of you. So just imagine just telling someone a little bit about yourself that doesn't know.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in this large world that we live in. My name's Ez. I'm an integrative therapist. My journey to becoming a therapist began with me accepting that I needed therapy myself to better understand myself, to better understand the ways that I reacted, the things that triggered me and why they triggered me. So one of those things I really wanted to talk about was what does being Black British actually mean? Because I'm a little confused. The reason I say that is because when I fill in those application forms, asks for your ethnicity, I was born in this country of Jamaican-born parents, so I'm first generation Windrush. When I fill in those forms, I always find myself going for Black Caribbean. So I always seem to go past Black British because for some reason I can't identify with that title, Black British, because I don't actually understand what that means. What does it mean to be Black British?
And that there, right there, is summing it up, what the idea of this podcast is about. Like, what does it actually mean to be Black and British? And through discussing a few things that we've highlighted for this particular podcast, I'm hoping that by the end of it, we'll all be able to notice a bit more how being Black and British is actually affecting our mental health in a negative way. Some other takeaway points I'd like for us all to be more aware of by the end is to have a better understanding of the term intersectionality and what that means and how that kind of relates to being Black and British. But that the idea of all of these podcasts is not just to talk about things that have already been spoken about, issues that people are already aware about, and just leave it there. The idea is to actually come up with some workable solutions that can help people navigate some of the difficulties that they may have. So without any more talk about that, I'm just going to jump straight in. And I think it's important to start with some indisputable facts about being Black and British. So as Black people, we make up about 3% of the population, approximately. That's a fact. What's also a fact is that Black people in Britain, in this country, experience more poverty. They experience more discrimination. They're overrepresented in the criminal justice system. They're more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. And there's just so much going on. Now, when I was researching for this podcast, one of the first things that really grabbed me was the idea, why is the podcast even being called Being Black and British? Why not Being Black and English? And to be honest, I found a very simple answer to that question. And it is that actually Black people cannot be English. Now, a lot of you may be aware of that. Some of you may not be aware of that. So I know if you turn on the TV and you watch sports, so just thinking of the England men's football team, you see players like Raheem Sterling, and you assume, Black English, it's okay. The last census, there is no option on the census to be Black English. You can be white English, you can be Black British. So before we get into the negative aspects of being Black and British, I thought it might be useful to put it out. And Ez, straight away, I'm going to put it over to you. Can you think of any of the good things about being Black and British?
British passport.
And straight in, that is where it leads, because I really struggled with this question. What are the good things about being Black and British? So I spoke around some of my friends and I put it to them, and some of them put forward some very good insights. And the first thing that really came up was when you're traveling. So, when you're abroad as a British person, you may go to the Caribbean or you may go to the United States, and they have this idea of the British accent and the royal family, and it can afford you a certain amount of status in those countries. So that was something that came up traveling, maybe not so much in Europe, where I would suggest it's a bit more racial, shall I say. I don't think necessarily being Black and British in some of the European countries, it would stop much discrimination. But there are large parts of the world, and a lot of people that see a lot of status about being British, whether you're Black British or you're white British. So I came up with that. And the only other thing that I could really put my finger on was maybe some of the elder generation. So as mentioned briefly, being a child of Windrush parents, and I know that my own grandmother, my Jamaican grandmother, felt very proud to be part of the Commonwealth and to come to this country and to settle her family here and just be a part of something that was seen at the time as the Great British Empire, that whole colonial history and so forth. But a lot of actually older Black people actually take a lot of pride in being Black and British. And I'll put that to you now, as how do you feel about being Black and British?
Conflicted, I think, is the only way that I can answer that one. Conflicted because, as I said earlier, born of Jamaican parents, first generation Windrush born child. My expectation from my parents was that I was to speak the Queen's English. I would come home from school. I grew up in an environment where my parents spoke with a Jamaican accent. They spoke like true-born Jamaicans in the Queen's England. So I would go to school. You'd mix with the kids at school. You'd mix with the staff at school. And this is where something that you call the proxy self comes into play. So looking back now, the person that I was at primary school was not the child that came home and went through my mother's and father's front door. Coming in through my mother and father's front door, I then assumed my Jamaicanness. I spoke like them, ate like them, behaved like them, was part of them, was one of them. But yet, that person that lived in that house with those parents was not the same person that was in that primary school.
And that is a very good point that you picked up on. So, as just briefly mentioned there about an idea of a proxy cell. Now, that may not be a term that many of you have heard, but it's essentially what we use to describe the way a Black child deals with white figures of authority, like the false self that is presented to white people that, are outside of the culture and maybe have been taught by the adults that all white people are suspicious in some way. So they have a way that they present with white people and a way that they present when in their natural habitat, so to speak, I should say. But we spoke about a few of the good things. And to be honest with you, I couldn't really think of many more things about being Black and British. But I could think of a lot more things that were negative. And for me, the problem for me essentially is firstly with the label. Being Black and British, what does that actually mean? And the first thing that jumps out at me is that we're not homogenous. We are not all alike, even within Caribbean communities, because my background, my grandparents are both Jamaican. I have Irish and also another Caribbean island, Grenada, in my mix. And I will say that even amongst Jamaicans, there are differences. So if you can imagine the Caribbean as a whole, everything is not the same. Like I made the point to you off air earlier, we as Black people are not even alike in terms of what we call or label our foods. Now, I'm grew up Jamaican and I know dumpling to be
Dumpling.
Yeah, dumpling. But I know from my best friend who's from St. Vincent and Barbados that they call it bakes. And I know that within the African community, they call plantain. So we cannot even agree on the terms that we describe our food. So we're really not all alike. And to me, that's problematic straight away, because by being all put in the category, even though we're born here, and in my case, my parents were also born here, we're lumbered in a category altogether. And it feels like also a bit like othering. Why do we have to be anything other than British? We already can't be English. why can we not be British? Any thoughts on that, Ez?
When we were speaking earlier in the week, curiosity got the better of me. So I did a little bit of research myself, and I came across the fact that you could be white British, you could be Polish British, you could be Gypsy British, and you could be Irish British. Now, my confusion is white British. Does that define a white person that was born in England, Scotland, or Wales? Because I didn't see Scottish British and I didn't see Welsh British, but I saw Irish British and I saw white British and I saw Polish British. So I got a little bit confused in how they've broken that down because.
So it is confusing how they've broken it down.
Yeah, and you might have heard me pause there because it is confusing. Why is it acceptable to have white British and Polish British, but you can't have, say for argument's sake, Trinidadian British, Bayesian, let's say it correctly, Bayesian British or Jamaican British? Why can't those terms exist? Why are we all put into the one basket and called Black British?
And that is, I couldn't actually sum it up any better because I have similar concerns. So that's the first problem that we've identified with that label. Another thing that came up when I was speaking with my friends and I said, I'm doing this podcast about being Black and British. Is there anything that comes to mind when you think about being Black and British? And I spoke to someone particularly close to me. And the first thing they said to me, which I know rings true, but it's actually quite shocking to hear, is it actually depends how Black you are. Now, we live in a society where we can't be blind to the privileges that exist. You know, the white male privilege, which is like top of the tree, and white women maybe potentially having certain privileges that, for example, Black women don't have. Black women having to deal with racial inequality as well as gender inequality. So that's a kind of like a basic concept of intersectionalism. So it's like you have different layers. So you might start off, like I said, this white man. And then if you're a Black man, you're going to have more discrimination than the white man, but you might have less discrimination than the Black woman. So then you can add things like disability and sexuality, and you can see how adding different layers of discrimination can really affect people. So depending how Black you are, and that's something that we're too relatively on the scale of light to dark, or to, I would say, brown, quite light, fair-skinned people. And I remember being young and getting really offended when people used to say things like light-skinned girls think they're too nice, and it was that whole narrative and that, and we used to get really defensive about it. And I think as a child and a young person growing up, I never really looked at that other side of it. But now being a therapist and being more aware of situations and looking at my own stuff, I've become more aware of some of the privileges that maybe you or I would have as opposed to a Black woman with darker skin. So we may get listened to less than the white woman, but more than the darker skinned Black woman. So again, being Black and British is just dependent.
Yeah, and the other thing that I take out of what you've just said there as well, which is a bit of flip negative side to it. You mentioned that when you were younger, you were referred to as light skin. So what did that do for your mental health? How did that make you fit in to being Black British?
It's really funny because I have white family members. Yeah. My mum has 3 half brothers that are white, and I've always had a white side of the family and a Black side of the family. And to me, they're both my family. I didn't really, so you know, when people say they don't see color and they don't see racism, in some ways, that's how I actually felt growing up, because I had this white family that validated me, and I had this Black family that also validated me. And I was able to converge the two very different aspects of my culture because they were both equally a part of my upbringing. And I was actually very proud of that. But as I got to secondary school and started mixing more with people, it was always thrown at me, oh, you're not that Black, or you're not Black enough. And it was always used as an insult. So I was having quite a smart mouth, always respond back and not really see where that was coming from, and that it could be a projection of what someone was feeling about the experience that they were having. So now, as a therapist and as someone that's done a lot of work in therapy to be more aware of my own bullshit, it really is being aware that colorism is an actual factor amongst Black British people. And that privilege, I cannot deny that I have it. So even in doing this podcast, I'm hoping to use some of that privilege that I now know that I have to give back and get other people talking about difficult topics. So the quickest way that I've found to break down this podcast is because we're not going to be able to cover everything, and it would be boring if we did. We'd have to set a time limit on things. We're just going to go through on a section by section basis on different aspects within our community and how their mental health is affected by being Black and British. So for the first segment, we're going to start with children. Now, the topic of children's mental health has come more into focus, especially after COVID. I think children on the whole were affected more than adults with a lot of the social isolation and the byproducts of lockdown. So I think there is that general awareness out there that children in particular, their mental health is not necessarily always being picked up because it presents differently. So there's that element. But right at the very beginning of the podcast, I outlined some indisputable facts. And one of them was that Black people live in more poverty than white people. All right. So I'm not saying that there aren't rich Black people, but Black people on the whole live in poverty more than white people. So when we're looking at children's mental health, there's not a lot of stats about Black children's mental health. It's something that needs to be addressed, needs to be looked at in order to go into some of the barriers and break down some of the barriers that there are in Black children accessing mental health care. But a stat that is particularly alarming is that children that live in poverty are 4 times more likely to suffer from mental health problems. So that Black children in general, so that's Black children, girls and boys, that would be included in that. Obviously, there are white children that live in poverty that would be affected. But if you consider that Black children live in poverty more, they suffer from more mental health. So you would think, okay, with that in mind, there's a lot of help out there. Everyone's familiar with CAMS, which is, I think, is the Children and Adolescent Mental Health Service. There's a particularly long waiting list in South London where I live. The last time I checked, it was over a year.
I think it's actually about just under 2 years.
Yeah,
now.
so just under 2 years. So check that out. So you have all these children that need help, and basically the service is just oversubscribed. But another alarming statistic about that is that these long waiting lists that are nearly 2 years long, only 5% of young people on that waiting list identify as Black. So we've got more mental health within our children, but we've got less access to the help that they need. So another brilliant reason why having you on this podcast today is particularly useful, because as well as being a therapist, your background is in education, and you're also actively at the moment a counsellor working in schools. So your experience firsthand will be really crucial, because we can look at stats all day, but there's nothing like experience. So I will put it over to you and let you take it from here and just outline briefly to the podcast the issues that Black children are suffering with differently to their white counterparts.
Okay, so I've worked in education for roughly 25 years, in one form, one role or another. I've been behaviour mentor, I've been an internal exclusion officer. My current role is school counsellor. Now, it's not just the experience that I've had as a school counsellor. I can go back to every role that I've had in a secondary school, and every single one of those roles I've had to interact with children, predominantly Black children, in the type of schools that I've worked in. Now, what you will find in those schools, especially in the school that I'm currently in, the role that I'm in now, I would say at least 70% of the students I see are Black. I would say at least 60% of the students I see are Black female. And out of those Black female, about 50% of them self-harm because they just can't cope. They can't cope with the pressures that have been put on them, the expectations that have been put on them, the support that they're not getting within the schools. And I'm not saying my school in particular, but all the schools I've worked in, I can say that I've witnessed Black children, when they act out, it's not seen as mental health, it's seen as behaviour.
Yeah.
So,
and that's a big point. Yeah.
That's another reason why I am now a school counsellor, because I spent quite a few years running an internal exclusion unit. And within that unit, most of the children that presented to me were presented to me with behavioural issues. But when I sat down and I had a conversation with those children, it's not behavioural issues. They're in pain. They're suffering. They do not understand what's happening to them.
And that is deeply informative and deeply disturbing. So there's a couple of points that you mentioned there that I want to pick up and run with. And I think the first thing you said is just the percentage that kind of really stuck out for me. The percentage of these children and how their misdemeanors and their bad behavior was, instead of being maybe looked at as mental health, is always looked at as some type of behavioral problem. But I wondered how big a problem, in your opinion, just quickly, briefly, if we can just get you to answer this, how big a problem do you think racism is for Black children in schools
It's a
currently?
massive problem. It's a massive problem because from experience in my exclusion unit that I worked in, I would find that the majority, again, of the children that were in that unit, and there'd be 8 every day, all day, and the majority of them are Black.
Okay, guys, I hope you guys are taking some time to absorb this. So most of these children are Black going through these issues. But you also made another big point, because I would definitely 100% expect discrimination such as racism to play a part in Black children's mental health. I think that's an obvious starting point. But you mentioned, you picked up on something else that kind of struck, and I call it the adultification. And I'm seeing more and more what I look at as Black children, for whatever reason, potentially maybe the different biology, because, you know, sometimes our children in proportion to other ethnicities tend to be maybe taller or bigger. And I think a lot of the time that can be not necessarily picked up within an education environment, and the behavior, the acting out, instead of looking at the behavior in terms of the child's age, maybe in terms of the child's size. And equally, the adultification that society as it is places on Black children, because I don't know, it may well be a thing for white children, but I know particularly for young Black males, just to single them out for a moment, the need to have really serious conversations about how you deal with the police, and how, if the police stop you, how you are to behave. And there's loads of organizations where you can get the stop and search rights and all of those things. But to me, it feels deeply sad that these children haven't, in their innocence, are having to have that innocence broken and are exposed to the harsh realities of the world for a Black child, which is racism at such an early age. I don't know, how do you feel about the adultification, and do you see that as being a factor?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, come on. If you're a young Black man, and your parents, your seniors, whoever it is that you've got around you, have to be telling you that you have to know your rights when you're being... Why do you have to know your rights when you're being stopped by the police? Why can't you just be treated like every other individual and not have to know your rights and be given those rights accordingly? Why does a young Black man have to challenge and fight for his rights in that situation? Why?
And I think that's a very good question. And I hope it's one that people are going away from after this podcast, maybe, and actually looking at some of the reasons why. And another thing I think I find a lot when it comes to Black children, and I saw some stats that kind of back this up, is that they're 10 times more likely to be referred to mental health services for children, such as CAMS, via routes such as social services and the criminal justice system. So that again makes me look and think, is this something that schools are completely missing? That our Black children are suffering with, in some cases, mental health, and either it's not being picked up or it looks completely different in Black children. But we don't have all the time in the world to get into those kind of aspects. We've highlighted it, but while we have you here as on this podcast, I think with all of your experience in young people's mental health, I always like to give my listeners something to take away from the podcast, and not just literally just outlining the problems, but maybe suggesting potential solutions. So you work very closely with young people. So what are parents in particular of children should be looking out for in terms of them suffering with their mental health, and what does it look like, and does it actually look different in children? What should we look out for, and what can we do?
Yeah, it does look different in children than it does in adults, because within children, they start to isolate themselves. I mean, I know as a teenager, you do tend to want to isolate yourself from your parents, stay in your room. If you're starting to find it difficult to have a conversation with a child, when you knew you were always able to have a conversation with your child, when you start getting the defenses, them not wanting to engage, constantly telling you that I'm fine, I'm okay, everything's all right, ask, what does that look like?
Yeah.
What does fine look like? Because my fine and your fine might be two different fines. So I'm not just going to accept as a parent that, I'm fine and leave it at that.
That's a very important point. And I think it's
Yeah.
not just when we interact with children, but in general, when we check in with people, there tends to be a tendency to ask quite a close question. Are you okay? Yes or no. It doesn't really leave much room for a discussion. And like you said, one person's fine and another person's fine is completely different. And I think children have a tendency by nature to downplay things. So you've mentioned the isolation. What other key bullet points could you pick out as a sign that your child might be suffering from some type of mental health?
The acting out, the being snappy, mood swings, changes in appetite, not wanting to go to school, or, where your child might have had a really good routine at going to school and all of a sudden that just changes out of nowhere. Question that. Why is that? What is happening within you? What are you feeling that all of a sudden now you don't go to school, or where you used to go to play football before? It doesn't even have to be school based.
Yeah.
It could be friends out in the local community that they are friends with. There could be issues there. It may look minor to us as adults, carrying all the pressures that we have now learnt to carry. But we need to also remember when we were children, and how we felt when people were bullying you or saying nasty things about you, like the light skin, how you felt about the lights.
And that's another thing that you've reminded me of in terms of what's affecting Black children's mental health. I guess with all children, but because it's an episode on being Black and British, we're focusing on Black children for this particular episode. But I do think there's an element of overburdening that comes within the parental raising experience sometimes. And I don't think it's always intentional. Maybe parents have more than one child. And I think a lot of young people that I see in therapy, not being specific to any particular, because it's all confidential, but one of the themes tend to be with young people is to do with their parents. Yeah, the parent is a really big one. I don't think parents necessarily always mean to overburden their children, but in some cases that happens unintentionally, but that kind of causes a lot of anxiety in children, I know. So the overburdening of children is another big factor in their mental health, especially with a mental health condition like anxiety. Maybe not so much depression, but certainly anxiety, which is all about worrying. So before we move on, to just give the listeners a few points that they could take away and things that they could do to help promote positive mental health in their children.
From my experience, what I've learned, simply just listen, not interrupt. They're going to struggle to articulate what they're trying to get over. That I've definitely experienced. I think the most powerful thing you can do is to listen and to understand, not judge.
Brilliant. And I think that's the case, particularly with children, even with adults, simply listening without bringing your own judgment into it. So sometimes children, they may have difficult things to say about you, for example. It's about being non-defensive and letting them get big emotions that we spoke about when we spoke about attachment, allowing them to get those big emotions out and creating that safe, that really safe space for them. So you've mentioned some good things there. I thought about this a lot. And I thought with a lot of the education system and the racism that is involved there, I know quite a few people now that have actually started homeschooling their children. And I know that's not suitable for everybody in terms of the amount of time they have available and so forth. But I don't know, in the 80s, they had something called schoolhouses where be like a few children from the community would go to this house that was converted into a school. And it got me thinking about potentially Black ex-teachers coming out of retirement and more people committing to this homeschooling process. So maybe giving them options. So if a child is particularly struggling with school and discrimination in particular is a factor, that they would have that kind of homeschooling to look at, and just simply not having the time would not be an obstacle. So things like that I thought about. And children, I know they always need positive role models is also very important with children, and just allowing them space to be children and exercise and play, and even if it's their computer games, whatever it is that they do for their self-care, just moving on with that. So Ez, thank you for that. The next time on the podcast, we're going to look a bit more in depth at what being Black and British means for Black men. So, guys, if you're joining me, and you have for the last couple of weeks, you'll be well aware of the concept by now. But just for those that haven't managed to tune in so far, my name is Leanna Devine. I'm an integrative therapist from Brixton, South London, and I created a podcast to enlighten people on the A to Z of issues that could be affecting them with their mental health. The aim is to become your own therapist. So you may have listened to the episodes on attachment and anxiety, and now we've moved on to B. We have an issue on boundaries, which will be included separately. Today, the topic on the podcast is being Black and British Part 2. Okay, so male mental health is something that's coming more and more into the spotlight. So the first thing I want to say in general about male mental health is that it's often compared with figures about females. So I spoke on my attachment and anxiety podcast about some of the figures in regards to mental health with men compared to women. Interestingly, I mentioned on the anxiety that women were twice as likely than men to suffer from anxiety or at least be diagnosed with it, and the same for depression. So women twice as likely. But then you don't have to go very far to look at some other figures. And that's the fact that 3 out of 4 people that die by suicide, because we don't say committing suicide, that die by suicide are men. So to me, straight away, that tells me that we're missing something in terms of male mental health in general. But when I think about Black male mental health, the figures are even more disturbing. So we only make up 3% of the population. I think I said that last time. But Black men are 10 times more likely to suffer from serious mental health disorders like psychosis. Okay, so 10 times more likely than their white counterparts. So I think it's about 3.2% compared to about 0.3% in white males. And another alarming statistic, 15% of those on remand in Britain at the end of September 2021 were Black. So once again, we only make up 3% of the population, but actually 15% of those on remand in prisons are Black. So straight away, it seems to show that despite being such a small part of the population, in terms of mental health representation and criminal justice representation at least, it's disproportionately higher. But if you go a little bit out into society, it gets worse. Black men are 7 times more likely to die in police custody, for example. Now, that's shocking. And straight away, Ez, I would just like to put this across to you. What are your thoughts in the issues that our Black British men are struggling with? Obviously, the obvious thing of the racism, so we won't go too much into that. Black people suffer from racism, and that's definitely severely affecting their mental health. But I think in terms of Black men, it's not as simple as that.
I think it goes way deeper than just racism for Black men. Black men, my recollection, they come forth from the ladder, don't they? There you've got the white man at the top, then you've got the white woman, then you've got the Black woman that sits above the Black man. Now, what does that do to a male, knowing that he sits in society below his Black woman, whereas his white counterpart sits above his white woman? What does that, just looking at that alone, what does that do to the way that a Black man will feel about himself?
And that's very important, because at the beginning of the podcast, I mentioned there being like a hierarchy that starts with white males. And then you might have white females, you've got Black males, Black females, and then you start adding these extra layers. Now, that term is termed intersectionality. So if you compare the experiences of a white man compared to a Black man, will have to deal with racial inequality. So we've got that. But we've mentioned in some of our conversations, and the many that we have, this kind of, I'm going to introduce a term. There is a book about this, but it's called post-traumatic slave disorder. So it's PTSD, but this post-traumatic slave disorder. And I feel like it shows up in men in different ways, because obviously Black men have to deal with the stereotypes of being labelled angry, aggressive, scary, all of that. But another particular stereotype, and I'm dying to hear your thoughts on this, is I feel like Black men to a certain degree have conformed to another stereotype. And without finding another way to describe what I'm talking about, it's the kind of over-sexualization of our Black men and the BDE, or the big dick energy, or this idea of this stallion, this Black stallion that's going to come and take away all of your white women. And I feel like Black men, especially in today's society, I feel like there is this over-sexualization of them, this whole idea that they are just sexual beings, just there for sexual pleasure and gratification. And while on the outside it might seem to them brilliant. I wonder what it does to their self-esteem, because there's a lot more to a black man than just having a big penis.
As you were saying that, my mind drifted right back to slavery. As you were saying that, in my mind, I visualized the image that was projected of a black man in the days of slavery. They were used as studs to bear more slaves. So the black man, in my eyes, taking on that stallion role in this day and age, I, rightly or wrongly, and not in to offend any black man out there in this world, but my visualization of that is he's still living up to that role.
Yeah, and I agree. And it's something that I hadn't thought about until a few years ago, and it almost came to me like an epiphany. So to me, it almost seems like a type of self-hate, but it seems to be quite unconscious in the sense that I think they maybe feel that they're getting something out of it, and I'm sure to a certain extent that they are, but I wonder sometimes what that does to their self-confidence, their self-esteem, and generally their overall mental health.
Absolutely. What does that do to somebody's mental health? They're going back to that black British label. Once again, it's on par with a black man being given a certain label, a certain image to have to live up to. So if that black man chooses or feels that he doesn't want to live up to that label, how does he then navigate amongst his peers that are living up to that label? What does that then do to his mental health?
Yeah.
Knowing that everybody around him is adopting this label and he chooses not to.
Very good points. And this is why I'm so glad that I have you on the podcast today. But because we're talking about being black and British in particular as well, something else that's come to my mind, because we're going to look at black women after we look at black men, but we often look at the strong black woman in terms of the negative things that is done for black women in their pursuit to be vulnerable and be seen and be heard. But I wonder what that title of strong black woman does to a black man and potentially his mental health.
It's another hurdle that he also has to battle, isn't it? Not only does he have to deal with the fact that he's a black man, he also has to deal with the fact the woman is seen as strong black woman. So why are we not labeling our black men strong black men?
Or the kings that they are. Is there a danger that we're demasculating our black men by empowering ourselves? Although, my
But did we empower ourselves?
Yeah,
though?
and that's something that we're really gonna get to. So, I don't know, I've spent some time thinking about it, because obviously on this podcast, I don't want it to just be rehashing the problems that a lot of people know already exist. So I've thought of some kind of things that I find that would be helpful in dealing with getting black men to open up more and addressing their mental health, because the fact that they're 10 times more likely to be sectioned and 7 times more likely to be killed in police custody, that's got to do something to their mental health. So one of the things that jumped out at me, I'm actually going on a course very soon, and it's called, the title of it really triggered something in my brain, and it's a mental health first aider course. And it got me thinking. Obviously, as a therapist, I've done a few years of training and all of the rest of that. So obviously you have to study to become a therapist. But as well as those qualifications, you're constantly updating your knowledge. And I recently attended a suicide awareness course, and I kid you not, it literally was about 3 hours long. And I came off of that course, and it wasn't just therapists in that course, it was just normal everyday people. And it gave me another idea. And I thought, how about getting people trained in things like suicide awareness, how to check in on a person, not just ask them if they're fine, how to really check in with a person. How useful would that be in the spaces that men in particular gravitate towards? So whether it be like the barbershops of this world or the gyms, wherever it is that men go to socialise, your local football team, a lot of men might be a member of a sports team, just having trained mental health first aiders in the same way that you have physical first aiders to be like the first port of call to highlighting issues, because 3 out of 4 of the suicides are men. So it means already that we're missing something. So it could be that the presentations are different. It could be that they're too scared to open up. It could be all of the above. But what are we doing as a community to make safe spaces for our black men? So is there anything you want to add on the issue of black men before we move on to have a look at how black British women's mental health is being affected?
I actually think that's absolutely viable idea. The sooner it's put in as an intervention to support and help our black men, the better. Places like garages, anywhere that a black man frequents, if there is that knowledge, that could save so many lives.
And that is what it's all about at the end of the day. It's about saving lives. Even if one life is saved through some information that's gained on this podcast, it will be worth the many hours of work and research that goes into producing it. So we're going to move on next to Black women and how being a Black woman and Black British is affecting Black women's mental health. So far on this podcast, we've looked a little bit about some of the pros and cons of being Black and British in general. We've had a little bit of a look at how Black children's mental health is being affected and put forward some kind of suggestions and ways of identifying this. We've looked a bit at Black men and briefly, very briefly, some of the issues that may be plaguing them. There are other series in the podcast that looks a bit more in depth at male mental health, but understandably, it's a podcast, it's a certain amount of time. We can't fit in everything or open the discussion to every point. But for now, we're going to move on to Black women. And it's something that I've spoke about in the previous podcast when I spoke about anxiety. And I compared men to women and said that women were twice as likely to suffer from anxiety. That's also true for depression. I also said that Black women, in comparison to white women, were more likely to suffer from both depression and anxiety, and highlighted some of the different presentations. So it looking a bit more like irritability and a certain way of doing things and constantly being angry, shutting down and withdrawing, different presentations that Black women seem to use as a defense to what they may be struggling with mentally. But another thing that really jumped out at me, and something that I've long held this belief, is that Black men at least are part of the discussion a lot of the time. But I think there's less visibility about issues that regard or refer to Black women in Black British society. So this statistic that I'm going to mention right now is so alarming that we cannot help but have to talk about it. Black women are 4 times more likely to die in labour. Obviously, it's a mental health podcast, but that is too alarming not to mention. It's literally, there's something that's costing Black women their lives. And for me, I've mentioned the negative connotations of being the strong Black woman and the tendency for white people to label Black women as strong. And when I say strong, I'm referring to Black women that are seen to be happy, secure and confident in their self are given that label. But where it's not useful is when they also can't be the opposite of that and show vulnerability. But there's also another aspect of the angry Black woman, and Ez, I'm really keen to get your thoughts on this, the angry Black woman that actually is brave enough to express how she feels and is actually becomes a stereotype for expressing how she feels and it being labelled as angry. But Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. What do you think are the issues at play here?
Can I deal with the angry Black woman?
Yes, you can. Why not?
Having experienced that label, I'll give you a little bit of a share, if that's okay. Some years ago, I worked in a predominantly white company, which I shan't name, and predominantly white senior managers within that company. I found myself in a position where I was working alongside those senior managers, and it felt, it didn't feel like, it felt like at the time, but actually what it actually was, every time I challenged, not aggressively, I must add, because you just don't do that sort of thing in the workplace, really. I don't. Every time I would challenge a decision that was made by a senior manager, it would be an issue, and actually got to the point where I was sent on an assertiveness course because I was seen to be an angry Black woman.
And I would be pretty confident that experience is one that's common to a lot of Black women, because I'm not particularly loud. My voice is not particularly loud. I don't particularly like shouting, but I've definitely had that thrown at me in the past. Why are you so angry? And that would usually be when I wasn't feeling any particular anger. I would probably say hurt. Anger's not usually a true emotion. There's usually things and layers to that anger, but maybe being hurt or feeling confused and wanting to express myself verbally, only to be shut down and told that I'm angry. So what does that do to not just their mental health, but what does that do to the perception of when Black women are then maybe complaining of things to their midwife or to their GP in regards to their treatment? And maybe if they're not seen as being communicating in the right way, being perceived as angry rather than worried or frightened or scared.
Yeah, why is that? Why is it? Because in that scenario, you're in labour, and I can actually draw on somebody else's experience. In labour, you're feeling a pain that you know is the same as the birth pain, the contraction pain that you know. You're feeling an additional pain that you know within your body just is not right. You express that, you're not heard. You continue to express it because you're now frightened, you're now scared, you're now worried. What is happening to me? Am I going to be all right? Is my baby going to be all right? And you're perceived to be the angry black woman when you're simply trying to get across the pain that you're feeling and the worry that you have about it. So that doesn't feel right.
Yeah. And this is it. And this is why a term that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, and one that I really want the listeners to get a grip of, is intersectionality, or being intersectional. We spoke about the white man. We spoke in this podcast about the black man. So the black man having that racial inequality put onto him, different to a white man. But where intersection starts coming into play is being a black woman. You now not only have a racial inequality, but you also have that combined with the gender inequality as well. So now you're seeing how two discriminations come together. So you've got the racial and the gender things both at play. And that is particularly problematic. And I think it doesn't help, because a lot of the time when people think of issues, they tend to think of women's issues being all women's issues. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. The struggle of the white woman and the struggle of the black woman is not the same. And then you have the struggle of the black man, which is highlighted. You see a lot of things, usually something negative that's been done to a black person. Nevertheless, a black man, it will be portrayed in the news, but with black women, less so. And I think that's particularly problematic. But what I also think needs to be taken into consideration with black women is the burden that they pick up for the breakdown of the family unit. There are a lot of women out there raising children by themselves. There are a lot of women raising children by themselves with help from an ex-partner, and equally a lot of women that don't receive that help. So you've got that extra responsibility that would come into play. So looking after the children, the parental responsibilities, the employment, keeping them clothed and fed. If you're a black woman and your child is having issues in school and you're trying to navigate the discrimination in the system. And then we have our children killing each other on the streets. So you have that extra layer. So black women are losing their children. Their presentations are not being recognised even by themselves. They're not recognising these aspects of their personality, and I say that in brackets, as symptoms of mental health. It's big. Any thoughts?
The mother constantly worrying about the child not coming. That one actually triggers me, because I personally have 3 female friends predominantly raised their male sons on their own, and all 3 have their sons taken. They lived in fear of it, and now they live in the fear.
And this is why I think podcasts like this, and hopefully there'll be more things that come out about this, but just looking at the black female experience. And something else that came to my attention, because I do a lot of work with neurodiverse clients, and neurodiversity is a big thing. And I think a lot of people have heard about the fact that women are less likely to be diagnosed with neurodiverse conditions such as ADHD, ASD, so the autism spectrum disorder, but equally things like dyslexia and dyspraxia not being picked up. And again, whilst I have you here on this podcast, I think it would be careless not to raise this issue of neurodiversity, because if black women follow the trends of how it is with white women in terms of ABA statistics and being more affected, then if white women are less likely to be diagnosed, black women are even less likely to be diagnosed. And do black women even know what to look for when it comes to neurodiversity? Is that something that's even spoke about? Because I know I have certain issues that definitely wasn't picked up during my schooling, and I know you do too.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, my whole entire school life, every single school report said, Ez can do better. Everyone. And the pressure that put on me, my parents expected high standards of education. And rightly so, because that was for me to be able to do better than they did, knowing the struggle that they had. They were trying to save me that struggle by wanting me that extra education just so that I could actually look after myself. I became an adult before I realised why my school reports constantly said S can do better. And it's simply because I was dyslexic and it was never identified. I now know that I'm severely dyslexic. How I've made it this far, I really don't know. But yeah, why was that not recognised?
And I can testify to that because we, as well as being great friends, we studied together. And once this was highlighted and picked up, you was able to receive the additional learning support that you needed and you was able to thrive. But I wonder, even just to quickly go back to children, it not being picked up there as neurodiversity as opposed to bad behaviour and acting out, but also with Black women not really being aware of these neurodiverse conditions that could be affecting their life. White women seem to be a bit more in the pocket when it comes to figuring out things like that. So, I don't know, we're both Black women. What do you find helpful with your experience of navigating mental health in Black British society? What are the things that Black women could be doing? Because we've already mentioned that their symptoms look different, and it's the irritation and insomnia being a big one. Later on in the series, we'll have a whole segment on sleep. It's very important, but Black women are not sleeping and it looking very different there. But what can we do as Black women to take care of our mental health? We can't stop the discrimination or anything like that, but what are the steps that we can take to protect our mental health? I don't know. All right, so I'll give you some time to think about it because I just sprung that on you. But the first thing I can think of is things like boundaries. So I spoke about boundaries in other podcasts, episodes and segments, and boundaries are so important when it comes to also how people treat you, but equally how you treat yourself. With boundaries, it will mean that you're never doing too much of anything, and self-care will always be as important as anything else. So aspects of self-care, I think, are particularly important for Black women. What are you doing for your self-care? And I'm not just saying always sitting down and watching Netflix. What are you actively doing to promote a feeling of well-being in yourself? Are you exercising? Are you eating correctly? Are you speaking to your friends about things that are disturbing you? Because I know, and we spoke about this, as that a particular thing in the Black community, and it does still extend, I would say that Black women probably communicate on an emotional level more than Black men, but I still think there are some reservations within Black female relationships about being truly open about your struggles. So there's something in that, in finding someone that you can trust and having someone to open up to as a Black woman, someone that will validate your experiences of racism and all the microaggressions that Black people in general deal with.
See, for me, that's a difficult one because my personal experiences, when I'm pretty good at picking up when something's not right with somebody, and I'll quite often ask the question, "Think okay?" And 9 times out of 10, it'll be, "Yeah, I'm fine. But when you know somebody,
Yeah.
and you know something's troubling them.
Yeah.
And for me, it's our inability to make ourselves vulnerable, share that. Obviously, you do need to share it with that person.
Yeah.
You do need to share it with somebody that's going to come back with something of value to you. So you do have to be careful. So I can understand the hesitation, but I think we as Black women need to be able to communicate with each other. We need to be able to share what we're really feeling, because just knowing you're not on your own,
And
that in itself.
That is so, so important. So the things like sister circles of kinds, just making regular time to go out with your friends and having those deep conversations. And maybe when checking in with friends, not simply asking, "Are you fine?" but actually delving a bit deeper into different aspects. How is work? How is your relationship? How are the children? And trying to pick up on those cues and those reading between the lines that come with those close relationships, because really and truly something needs to change, because Black women are suffering in a way that other people in society are not, just because our story's never told. And I think that's so, so important. But, unfortunately for time concerns, we have to leave that there. But throughout the podcast, we'll be referring to issues to do with Black women in general and sticking on that. But for the last 10 or so minutes of the podcast, I really want to look at another section of Black British society that I genuinely don't think gets spoken about much. And there's loads of particular reasons for that. But for me, the main factor is ignorance. And I'm going to say it's the LGBTQIA+. And there are many other ways that people identify. They're not just those ways, but it's very important when dealing with anybody that you query when you meet them, how you address them and so forth. I think that's a common courtesy. but LGBTQIA plus people in particular suffer from more mental health. They suffer from more depression, they suffer from more anxiety, and they also, quite alarmingly, suffer from more drug and alcohol issues. Now, there are some people that maybe listen to this podcast that in itself would not be surprised that LGBT plus, I'm just going to shorten it down a bit, people experience more mental health. However, what would be a bit more surprising is being a lesbian or gay or bisexual, for example, is not the reason for your mental health. The issues with mental health come from the stigmas that's attached with being different. You know, some of the stigmas, some of the social isolation, some of the family isolation, particularly in the Black community. I know it's a thing definitely in European worldviews and stuff. The coming out is a big thing, but, you know, we studied together and we've done a lot of work on gay affirmative therapy and so forth. And the experience of Black people is very different. There's some Black people that have always known they're gay. Maybe they have friends, close friends around them, maybe close work friends around them that maybe know they're gay, but on the whole, to their family, they're not out of the closet. So that's the first thing that could explain why Black people that are part of this community suffer more than the white people in the community. Even though the white people suffer more than the general population, Black people that identify in that community are suffering more and more. And I think it's often spoke about racism. We know that Black people have experienced racism and we're going through a lot of stuff internally with colorism and our children killing each other. But what I find within the Black community is that they're not so open to a discussion where it involves discriminating against other sectors of the community. And we spoke about intersections. So we imagine being a Black male now and then being part of the LGBTQIA plus community. So you can see that you're adding another marginalized discrimination onto discrimination that already exists. And it's even worse with females. So even within that community, there's racism. And a lot of the time, Black LGBT people often feel left out completely. They're not accepted in a community that is supposed to be inclusive to them, but they're equally not accepted within their own communities. Is there anything that you would like to add to this? Because I know it's something that you feel particularly strongly about.
Yeah. What does it do to somebody? It's the question I love for people to really hold in their minds. What does it do to a person? First, you're Black. Secondly, Black male. Thirdly, Black male gay person. That's 3 different intersections that this one person has to deal with in their every single day life. Funnily enough, I had a conversation earlier on with my son. The conversation was how he felt before he came out, how he felt after he came out, and where he is now. So that's 3 processes he's had to go through. He's had to carry the weight and hidden himself for who he really is from family, from friends. He's then got to the stage where he's been able to, I'm good with myself now, so I can come out and I can be who I really am. But in doing that, it doesn't end there, because then he has to then go through the process of defending who he is.
Yeah.
When does he finally get to the stage where he can walk the streets and not have to defend his colour, not have to defend the fact that he's a man, or not have to defend the fact that he's a Black man? And when do we get there?
And this is the issue. And this is why I used to challenge it a lot, because a lot of the literature around dealing with gay and LGBT plus clients is around how to deal with white clients. It's based on, a lot of the research is based on white people, and it doesn't include that extra level of discrimination and cultural, what could I call it, being adverse to what they see as certain sexual behaviors. So what that kind of does, so, you know, whereas someone might be able to tell that for example, you're a Black male or you're a Black female just by looking at you, it wouldn't necessarily be so obvious if a person's gay. Obviously, if they are, you know, particularly feminine or, you know, or they present particularly masculine, it may be a bit more observable, but that's not necessarily the case, because not every feminine man is gay.
Absolutely not.
So that's another common misconception. You couldn't really blame Black people in this community for firstly, not being safe to come out, because there being so much hate crime and people that are actually prepared to kill you for who you love, but having to hide aspects of their self, maybe due to religion or, you know, or things like that. And it really is quite heartbreaking to think that within our own community, we have another community of people that feel disconnected from the Black community and the Black British community. So what is their mental health and their experience of being Black British? Do they care much about being Black British? Does that even include them? As are people that are, not part of that community, are we even accepting these people as even part of our community? And why not? And it's absolutely horrifying.
It is, because people should be allowed to be who they really are. We shouldn't be projecting our thoughts and feelings and ways of being onto somebody else. We don't have to accept that's who they are, that's why they are, that's how they are. What's wrong with respect?
And I think that's a key point, because you often find one of the biggest barriers to people, like they don't understand it. I don't understand that lifestyle, or they might quite offensively suggest that you've chosen that lifestyle, which is very offensive, by the way, guys. So I hope we're not doing that. But we live in a world now where there's so much access to research. There's no excuse for not understanding anything these days. Anything you don't know, you can put into Google and you will have the information at your fingertips. So whereas maybe 30 years ago, people were a bit more accepting to that attitude of we don't accept it, so therefore all of that comes with that. Now I don't even think that's good enough. I think we have a fundamental duty to respect all people regardless of their sexual orientation.
Absolutely.
So I thought a lot about this when putting this podcast together, and I thought some of the common things that maybe might help the Black community when navigating difference within their own community is to firstly to open your mind and open your ears and not always be so quick to react. Try to learn about the person. And so the first thing I would suggest is that when introducing yourself, it's quite simple. It doesn't take much more time. I could say, for example, I'm Leanna and my pronouns are she, her. And equally, you could ask the person, how do you identify? Or what would you like me to call you? And people were quite forthcoming. They may be like, I identify as they, them, or I don't mind he or they. So it's just about getting that knowledge. Don't assume that you know, because how do you see non-binary? You can't see that either. You can't see non-binary. So how would you know unless you ask? So it's just getting into the habit of just asking people how they identify. Secondly, for any gay or lesbian, transgender, anyone that comes underneath the umbrella of that community that's listening, there's going to be people in this world that are ignorant, and there's going to be people that show hate towards you, and that can be very damaging to your mental health. I know there's going to be certain family situations where you're not going to be able to come out and it's not safe to do so, and that's absolutely fine. But it's very important that you find a network of people that love, support and validate, and what you said as accept you for who you are.
Yeah, accept what we need to really do.
We just have to get used to accepting people who they are. It's like, I hate Arsenal. I'm a Tottenham supporter. I hate Arsenal. But, for me, someone not wanting to have a relationship with me for being gay is equally ridiculous as someone not wanting to have a relationship with me for supporting Tottenham. I have a lot of Arsenal supporter friends. To me, it's that ridiculous. But I am a therapist and I'm a bit more open-minded. But there's a lot of judgment. So I think for young people in this community, even the older ones, is finding your tribe. Finding your tribe. People that love and validate you. There are different support groups out there. There are people out there that are struggling with the same things. If you're struggling internally with coming out or any issues to do with coming out, there are good therapists that do like gay and lesbian and LGBTQIA plus affirmative therapy. There's representation. There are therapists that operate within that community. So do you have anything to add? What could you do to maybe, if there's a parent listening who may suspect that their child may be gay or lesbian or maybe even transgender, how would, it might help?
As a parent, I think if you have that feeling, if there's something niggling you and telling you that something's not right or something's different or however you want to term that, because I don't even think me saying something's not right was even the right thing for me to say in that scenario. So if you're feeling that something's troubling, I think the best thing you can do as a parent is to educate yourself. Find out, there are websites that, as Lee said earlier, there are lots of support groups out there can support you as the parent to support your young person. So if you really want to help your child in the best way possible, help yourself first.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I do have a certain empathy towards parents, and I understand that even the most accepting parent has to go through a particular type of grieving process, because obviously when you have children, you have certain expectations, and One of the big things that comes up is I want grandchildren. So educating yourself around that, because there's ways to become parents and there's ways for you to still become grandparents. So excuse me, guys, sorry about that, but all help is not lost. Just in summarizing this whole podcast in general, because it's been quite a long one and hopefully it started some good discussions, but just to remind you of some of the key takeaways that you can take away when dealing with being Black and British, because like I said at the beginning, we can't change the fact that Black people are going to be living in more poverty. We may not be able to even change the fact that we're going to suffer from mental health more, but the things that we can change is accessing the support that's available. And there's also things that we can do to help ourselves, because this is what this podcast is all about. What can we do to help ourselves with what we're struggling with? So finding your tribe, surround yourself with love, people that support and validate you. Simple things like speaking out against discrimination as
positivity. Always be positive in everything that you do.
It's difficult sometimes to find the right word at the right time. But continuing from what I'm saying, there's things that you can do for yourself. So calling out microaggressions as they occur, because we all know that microaggressions are an everyday part of being Black and British, whether that be child, male, female, non-binary. I've mentioned briefly at the beginning the idea of mental health first aid. So in the same way that you have physical first aiders, having mental health first aiders, more people trained in, for example, things like suicide awareness, things like how to really check in with people. So we didn't really mention it much there, but simply not just asking if they're fine, going into greater details, being able to read their body language and read between the lines, to doing things like reflecting back to show them that you're listening to them. And the most important thing, if you do not know what to say, is not to say anything, just to simply listen. We mentioned some home community schooling for children, maybe the prospect of retired Black teachers coming out of retirement and coming back into the workforce to support this. Something that I didn't really speak much about, because like I said, there's limited time, is the idea of activism. And by activism, I don't necessarily mean getting your placards and going and chaining yourself to a railing or anything like that. But obviously, if you feel like protesting is the way that you would like to do it, then by all means do it within the law. But even if it's just calling out injustice and racism on your social media, attending meetings to do with something that's happening in your local community, to do with Black people in your community. So just feeling a part of it. So that powerless feeling that you can often feel as when you're Black and British or Black in general, you feel a little bit less powerless. Seeking help is a big one. Hopefully this podcast is making people more aware that there's different representation now in the field of therapy and mental health. The workforce is starting to look a bit more like the clients, a bit more representative. It's the best time now to be getting into therapy, for example. You have so much choice over what type of therapist you have. You can choose a Black female therapist, a Black male therapist. You can choose a gay therapist, whatever it is that you need. And another one of the final points is to really research what you don't understand, because it's very easy for us to speak and to offend someone and hurt them and damage them mentally. But if we actually arm ourselves with research, it's less likely to happen. So on that note, as before I wrap it up, anything else you can think of that you can give to people to deal with being Black and British?
Understand the impact of Black British.
Yeah.
And understand mental health.
Yeah. And how important it is
to have that mental health.
Until I think it's often, and it's only when people lose aspects of their mental health, when they start to suffer badly with their mental health, that they realize how much they take it for granted. So it's about doing those small little things that can make your life better. We can't change racism. We can't change the world, but we can make each other's lives a little bit better by being a bit more accepting. And the same acceptance that we want being Black and British and the identity that we want, we have to be able to give it to others too. So I hope it's been helpful. Ez, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
You're welcome.
And I know my listeners will thank you so much for your insights. It's been great. And I know that you will be popping in from time to time throughout the podcast. So it's definitely not the last they will hear of you. So just for anyone that's interested in, because you are a working therapist, any idea of how they can find you?
Oh, you can find me on the BACP website. You can find me on my own website, which is www.esteemedminds.com, or you can find me on the Awareness Centre website, available for therapy in all three places.
And remind them of your full name, just in case
Oh,
they didn't
sorry, I
catch
didn't
it.
actually give them my full name at the beginning, did I?
No.
And I'm just so used to calling myself Ez. My name's Ez Wainwright, psychotherapist.
Okay, so you've been lucky today, guys. Normally you have one therapist from Brixton, but today you had two therapists from Brixton on your sound wave. So hopefully we've started up some good discussions and given you a few things to take away from it. So with that, I will not bore you anymore, and I shall see you next time on TAP, otherwise known as the Alphabet Podcast. Goodbye.